The slave markets of Zephyria Prime stank of fear and desperation. Thousands of beings from conquered worlds stood chained beneath the twin suns, their eyes hollow with defeat. Among them, a small figure sat with her back straight despite the heavy iron collar around her neck. Elena Rodriguez had been a xenobiology professor at Terra University before the Carthax Empire swept through human space like a plague. Now she was just another piece of merchandise, her dark hair matted, her clothes torn, but her spirit unbroken. She watched the alien buyers examine her fellow prisoners like livestock, their forearms prodding and poking, while they discussed prices in their clicking language. The crowd parted as Lord Commander Vextar approached her section. The Carthax noble stood 9 feet tall, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming black under the harsh sunlight. Multiple eyes on stalks turned to study each slave, but when they fixed on Elena, something changed in his posture. The other Carthax merchants immediately stepped back, their own eyes darting between the commander and the human female. This, on. Vextar's voice rumbled through his translation device, pointing one massive claw at Elena. How much? The slave trader's mandibles clicked nervously. My lord, she is quite expensive. A rare specimen from the recently conquered Terra system. Very intelligent, they say. Perhaps you would prefer something more conventional? Vextar's head tilted, studying Elena more closely. She met his gaze without flinching, her chin raised in defiance. Most slaves cowered when he looked at them, but this small human seemed to be measuring him just as carefully as he was measuring her. She will do, he said simply, transferring a fortune in credits to the trader's account without haggling. As the chains were transferred to Vextar's personal guards, Elena heard the whispers starting among the other Carthax. Another trophy for the commander's collection. He does love his exotic pets. Wonder how long this one will last. The journey to Vextar's estate took 3 days aboard his personal transport. Elena was given clean clothes and decent food, but she remained shackled in a luxurious cell. Through the viewport, she watched as they approached the capital world of the Carthax Empire. The planet's surface was covered in massive spire cities that reached toward the sky like obsidian daggers. Vextar's estate sat on a floating platform high above the main city. As Elena was led through corridors lined with trophies from 100 conquered worlds, she began to understand the whispers at the slave market. Ancient weapons hung next to preserved specimens from extinct species. Holographic displays showed Vextar's military victories, each one representing the death of an entire civilization. Her new quarters were larger than her old apartment on Earth, furnished with items clearly chosen for their exotic nature rather than comfort. A window looked out over the sprawling city below, but electromagnetic barriers made escape impossible. As night fell over the alien world, Elena sat on the edge of the ornate bed and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of her situation. She was alone, billions of light years from home in the hands of a creature who collected beautiful things from dead worlds. Earth was gone, her family was gone, and now she was just another trophy in a monster's collection. But as she looked around the room, Elena noticed something the Carthax had probably missed in their conquest. Hidden in the architecture were subtle design elements that seemed almost human. The proportions of the furniture, the color schemes, even the way the light was positioned. It all suggested someone who understood human psychology had influenced this room's design. Elena filed this observation away carefully. In her experience, even the smallest details could be important when trying to understand a new species. Outside her window, the Carthax city pulsed with alien life, its inhabitants going about their business under the light of unfamiliar stars. Elena pressed her hand against the cool glass and made herself a promise. She would survive this. She would learn everything she could about these creatures and their empire. And someday, somehow, she would make them pay for what they had done to humanity. The door chimed softly, and Elena turned to see a service droid entering with an evening meal. The food was surprisingly palatable, clearly chosen to appeal to human tastes. As she ate, Elena wondered about the mind behind these small kindnesses. Was Vextar truly just another alien conqueror, or was there something more complex at work here? Tomorrow would bring new challenges and possibly new insights into her captor's nature. Tonight, Elena would rest and plan. She had been a scientist before she became a slave, and scientists were trained to observe, hypothesize, and adapt. These skills would serve her well in the days to come. The twin moons of the Carthax homeworld rose over the Spire city as Elena finally lay down to sleep. In the distance, she could hear the strange music of an alien world, but in her dreams, she walked through the corridors of Terra University once more, teaching eager students about the wonders of xenobiology. Little did she know that her greatest lesson in understanding alien minds was just beginning. Elena's first week in captivity followed a strange routine. Each morning, a service droid brought breakfast and fresh clothes. She was allowed to move freely within her quarters and access an extensive digital library, though she noticed it contained mostly Carthax literature and scientific texts. Most surprisingly, she was given no tasks or commands from her captor. On the 8th day, everything changed. The door to her quarters opened and Vextar himself entered. Up close, Elena could see the intricate patterns etched into his exoskeleton, marking him as nobility. His multiple eyes studied her for a long moment before he spoke. "You have been observing," he said, his translated voice carrying an odd tone. "The guards report you spend hours watching the city below." "What do you see?" Elena considered her words carefully. "I see a society built on conquest. Your spires reach toward the sky because you've learned to take everything from the ground up. The architecture follows function over beauty, except—" She paused, gesturing toward her quarters. "Except in spaces designed for those you've conquered." Vextar's head tilted in what Elena was beginning to recognize as curiosity. "Elaborate." This room wasn't designed by a Carthax architect. The proportions, the lighting, even the furniture placement, it all follows human psychological principles for creating comfort and reducing stress. Someone who understood my species designed this space. For the first time, Vextar stepped closer, his massive frame somehow managing not to seem threatening. "You were listed in the slave records as a xenobiologist. Your observations suggest this was accurate." "I studied alien life forms, yes, including intelligence patterns and social structures." Elena met his gaze steadily. "Your people aren't the first conquerors I've encountered in my research, just the most successful." Something shifted in Vextar's posture, and Elena realized she had surprised him. In the Carthax Empire, slaves were not expected to engage in intellectual discourse with their masters. They were decorative objects, living trophies to display wealth and power. "Walk with me," Vextar commanded, and Elena found herself being led through corridors she had only glimpsed before. The estate was even larger than she had imagined, filled with artifacts and specimens from dozens of conquered worlds. But as they walked, Elena began to notice patterns. The displays weren't just random collections of pretty objects. They were organized by species, with detailed information about each civilization's culture, technology, and eventual fate. "You maintain records of the worlds you've conquered," Elena observed. "I maintain memories," Vextar corrected. "Your species calls it history. We call it necessity." They stopped before a massive holographic display showing the conquest of a world called Thessara. Elena watched as Carthax fleets overwhelmed planetary defenses, and ground forces methodically eliminated resistance. The simulation was clinical, efficient, and utterly devastating. "Why show me this?" Elena asked. "Because you are the first trophy who has asked questions instead of begging for mercy or plotting escape." Vextar's eyes rotated to study her reaction. "Your species fought harder than most. Even when defeat was certain, human ships continued to attack. Your people chose death over surrender." Elena felt a surge of pride mixed with grief. She had seen the reports before Earth's final fall, human colonies making last stands against impossible odds. Civilian ships ramming Carthax dreadnoughts, entire populations choosing mutual destruction rather than slavery. "We're stubborn that way," she said quietly. "Stubborn," Vextar repeated, testing the word. "The translation algorithms struggle with human emotional concepts. In Carthax, we have no equivalent for dying for abstract principles." They continued through the estate, and Elena began to understand something disturbing about her captor. Vextar wasn't a simple conqueror collecting pretty things. He was a scholar of extinction, methodically documenting the species his people had destroyed. Every trophy in his collection represented not just individual conquest, but the final remnant of an entire civilization. The tour ended in a vast library where holographic displays showed the rise and fall of dozens of species. Elena saw the mathematical elegance of the Christine Collective, the artistic achievements of the Veltar communes, the technological marvels of the Android Republic. All of them were gone now, reduced to museum pieces in an alien's private collection. You're preserving them, Elena realized. These aren't trophies, they're memorials. Vextar's mandibles clicked in what Elena was learning to recognize as approval. Perhaps your species' intelligence was not overestimated in the conquest reports. As they returned to her quarters, Elena found herself seeing her captor in a new light. He wasn't just another alien monster. He was something far more complex and potentially more dangerous. Vextar was a being who could appreciate the civilizations he helped destroy, who could study and admire the very species his people hunted to extinction. "Why am I here?" Elena asked as they reached her door. "Really, I mean. Not just another pretty trophy, obviously." Vextar paused, his multiple eyes focusing on her with an intensity that made Elena's skin crawl. "Because your species presents a unique problem. We have conquered your worlds, enslaved your people, destroyed your fleets. But we have not broken your spirit. Even here, even now, you stand before me without fear." Elena felt a chill run down her spine as she understood the implication. She wasn't just a specimen to be studied. She was a puzzle to be solved. The Carthax had conquered humanity's territory, but they had not conquered the human spirit itself. And Vextar, scholar of extinct civilizations, was trying to understand how to complete that final victory. "You want to know what makes us different," she said. "I want to know what makes you human," Vextar replied, and Elena heard something almost like longing in his translated voice. "And when I understand that, I will know how to destroy it." The next few months brought a strange new routine to Elena's captivity. Every few days, Vextar would visit her quarters, and their conversations would stretch for hours. He questioned her about human history, philosophy, and culture with the methodical precision of a scientist dissecting a specimen. Elena found herself in an impossible position. Every answer she gave might help him understand humanity better, but understanding could lead to more effective methods of conquest and control. Yet she also began to suspect that Vextar was learning more than he had bargained for. "Explain this concept your species calls love," he commanded during one session, displaying holographic records from human literature and history. Elena chose her words carefully. "It's a bond between individuals that transcends logic or survival benefit. Humans will sacrifice themselves for those they love, even when it serves no practical purpose." "Inefficient," Vextar observed. "Yet your military records show this inefficiency made your soldiers fight harder, not weaker." "Love isn't about efficiency. It's about connection. When humans fight for something they love, they're fighting for meaning beyond their own survival." Vexitar's multiple eyes studied her intently. "You speak of love as if you have experienced it." Elena felt a pang of loss as she thought of Marcus, her colleague and partner who had died during Earth's final siege. "Yes, I have. Where is this individual now?" "Dead. He was killed defending the university when your people invaded." For a long moment, Vextar was silent. Then he asked, "Do you hate me for his death?" Elena considered the question seriously. Over these months of captivity, she had come to see Vextar as more than just another alien conqueror. He was brilliant, curious, and possessed of a strange sort of honor. But he was also directly responsible for the extinction of her entire species. "Yes," she said finally, "but I also pity you." Vextar's head snapped back as if she had struck him. In Carthax society, pity was the deepest insult possible. "Explain." "You collect the remnants of dead civilizations because some part of you recognizes their beauty and value. But you can never truly understand what you've destroyed because you've never experienced the, connections that made those civilizations worth preserving in the first place. I understand tactical value, resource allocation, strategic benefit." "You understand conquest," Elena interrupted, "but you don't understand creation. You've never built something beautiful just because it brought joy to others. You've never sacrificed personal gain to help someone you care about. You've never felt the satisfaction of teaching someone something that made them better than they were before." Vextar rose to his full height, towering over Elena's small frame. "You assume much about my experiences?" Do I? Then tell me about a time when you chose to help someone even though it cost you something. Tell me about something you created rather than conquered. Tell me about anyone in your life who would mourn if you died tomorrow. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably long. Elena realized she had pushed too hard, but she was tired of being studied like a laboratory specimen. If Vextar wanted to understand humanity, he needed to confront the differences between their species honestly. Your words suggest you believe the Carthax are incapable of such experiences, Vextar said finally. I believe your society doesn't value them. That doesn't mean individuals within it can't learn. Something shifted in Vextar's posture, and Elena realized she had just crossed a line she hadn't even known existed. Over the following weeks, their conversations took on a different tone. Instead of interrogating her about human nature, Vextar began asking hypothetical questions about how someone might develop the emotional connections that drove human behavior. Meanwhile, Elena was making discoveries of her own. The service droids that attended her were more sophisticated than she had initially realized, and their behavior patterns suggested they were learning from their interactions with her. When she mentioned missing certain Earth foods, they began experimenting with local ingredients to recreate familiar flavors. When she expressed loneliness, they started playing recordings of human music during her meals. More significantly, she began to notice changes in the estate itself. Subtle modifications were being made to common areas. Lighting adjusted to more closely match Earth's sun. Seating arrangements altered to accommodate human social patterns. Even small decorative elements that seemed designed to provide psychological comfort rather than display wealth. One evening, Elena was studying Carthax literature when Vextar arrived unannounced. Instead of his usual commanding presence, he seemed almost hesitant. I have been considering your words about creation, he said without preamble. You suggested that understanding requires experience rather than observation. That's right. You can analyze the components of music, but you can't understand its emotional impact until you feel it yourself. Vextar extended one of his massive hands, and Elena saw he was holding a small crystalline device. This contains a neural interface that would allow you to experience Carthax sensory input and emotional states. In exchange, I would experience human consciousness temporarily. Elena stared at the device, understanding the implications immediately. This wasn't just about scientific curiosity anymore. Vextar was offering to literally share consciousness with her, to experience the world through human perspective while allowing her to see through Carthax senses. That's incredibly dangerous, Elena said. Neural interfaces between incompatible species can cause permanent psychological damage. Yes, Vextar agreed, but it would provide data that no amount of questioning could yield. Elena looked at her captor, really looked at him. For months she had been trying to understand what drove this complex creature, who collected the remnants of extinct civilizations. Now she realized he was struggling with the same questions about humanity that she had been trying to answer about the Carthax. Why? She asked. Why risk this? Vextar was quiet for a long moment. Because your species haunts me, he said finally. I have studied 1,000 conquered races, but none of them continue to resist after total defeat. Your people should be broken by now, yet they are not. I must understand why. Elena took the device, feeling its weight in her palm. She understood that this decision would change everything between them, one way or another. But she also realized it might be the key to something more important than her own survival. If we do this, she said, and you experience human emotions directly, love, empathy, hope, you might not be able to continue serving an empire built on conquest and extinction. I know, Vextar replied, and Elena heard something new in his voice that she had never detected before. Uncertainty, fear, and underneath it all, a desperate kind of longing that made her wonder if perhaps the gap between their species wasn't as vast as it seemed. The neural interface procedure took place in Vextar's private medical facility, deep within the estate's security levels. Elena had insisted on reviewing the technical specifications first, her scientific training making her cautious about the unknown risks. The device was surprisingly elegant, a crystalline matrix that would create temporary neural bridges between their different brain structures. The connection will last approximately 6 hours, Vextar explained as medical droids prepared the interface. During that time, we will share not just sensory input, but emotional states and memory associations. You will experience the world as a Carthax, and I will understand human consciousness. Elena nodded, though her heart was racing. She had agreed to this partly from scientific curiosity, but mostly because she sensed it might be her only chance to truly reach the being who held her captive. If she could make Vextar understand what it meant to be human, perhaps she could find a way to help the scattered remnants of her species. The procedure itself was surprisingly gentle. Elena felt a warm tingling as the neural matrix activated, and then the world exploded into new dimensions of sensation. Through Vextar's senses, Elena experienced reality as the Carthax did. Colors existed beyond the human visual spectrum, and she could perceive electromagnetic fields as clearly as shapes and movement. His multiple eyes allowed for simultaneous focus on dozens of different points, creating a dizzyingly complex view of the world that somehow felt natural within his consciousness. But it was the emotional landscape that truly shocked her. Vextar's mind was a vast organized space filled with carefully categorized information and experiences. Where humans felt chaotic rushes of emotion, he experienced precise analyzed responses to stimuli. Everything was logical, efficient, and utterly lonely. Elena realized that Carthax society had evolved to eliminate the messy emotional connections that drove human behavior. They were supremely logical beings who could make perfect tactical decisions because they never had to consider the emotional costs of their actions. No wonder they were such effective conquerors. They literally couldn't feel empathy for their victims. But Elena also sensed something else in Vextar's mind that she hadn't expected. Hidden beneath layers of logical analysis were fragments of something that felt almost like longing, memories of observing the emotional connections between slaves, wondering what it would feel like to experience such bonds himself. On the other side of the neural bridge, Vextar was experiencing human consciousness for the first time. Elena felt his shock as he encountered the chaotic storm of emotions that drove human thought. Through their shared connection, she sensed his confusion as he tried to process feelings that had no logical purpose, but nonetheless felt overwhelmingly important. He experienced her memory of Marcus, not just the facts of their relationship, but the actual emotions involved. The joy of intellectual partnership, the comfort of emotional support, the devastating grief of loss. For the first time in his existence, Vextar understood what humans meant when they spoke of love. But he also experienced Elena's feelings toward him, and that proved to be the most complicated aspect of the entire exchange. Through the neural link, he felt her fear, anger, and hatred for what he represented, but he also sensed her growing respect for his intelligence, her pity for his emotional isolation, and something else she hadn't fully acknowledged even to herself, a growing affection for the complex being beneath the conqueror's exterior. Hours passed in a blur of shared experience. Elena watched through Vextar's memories as he systematically documented the extinction of dozens of species, but now she felt his hidden grief at each loss. He had been preserving these civilizations not just as trophies, but as a desperate attempt to hold on to something beautiful that his people were destroying. Meanwhile, Vextar experienced Elena's memories of Earth, not just her personal experiences, but her emotional connections to her entire species. He felt what it meant to belong to a community, to care about the welfare of people he had never met, to find meaning in contributing to something larger than individual survival. When the neural interface finally deactivated, they both sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Elena felt strangely empty without Vextar's logical perspective balancing her emotions, while he seemed to be struggling with the unfamiliar chaos of lingering emotional responses. "I understand now," Vextar said finally, his voice strangely subdued. "The connections your species forms, they create meaning beyond individual existence. You fight so hard because you're not just fighting for your own survival. And I understand why your people are such effective conquerors," Elena replied. "You can make the brutal decisions necessary for victory because you don't form emotional attachments to those you destroy." Vextar's multiple eyes focused on her with new intensity. "But the experience of your emotions, they do not simply disappear when the interface ends. I can still feel echoes of what you call love, grief, hope. How do you function with such chaos in your mind?" Elena almost smiled at his confusion. "We don't function despite the chaos. We function because of it. Emotions give us reasons to live, to create, to sacrifice. They're what make existence meaningful rather than just efficient." Inefficient, Vextar murmured, but without his usual conviction. Beautiful, Elena countered. Over the following weeks, Elena noticed dramatic changes in Vextar's behavior. He began visiting her quarters more frequently, but their conversations shifted from interrogation to something more like genuine dialogue. He asked questions about emotional experiences he couldn't fully understand, but was clearly trying to process. More significantly, Elena began to observe changes in how Vextar managed his estate. The service droids were reprogrammed to show more consideration for the emotional needs of various species in his collection. Lighting and environmental controls were adjusted to provide psychological comfort rather than just physical survival. Small changes, but they represented a fundamental shift in perspective. Elena realized that the neural interface had accomplished something she hadn't expected. Vextar wasn't just studying human emotions anymore. He was trying to develop them himself. The precise logical mind that made him an effective conqueror was struggling to incorporate the chaotic emotional connections that made life meaningful. But she also recognized the danger in this transformation. If Vextar truly began to develop emotional attachments, he would face an impossible choice between his loyalty to the Karathax Empire and his growing understanding of what that empire was destroying. Elena found herself in the strange position of helping her captor learn to feel emotions that might ultimately turn him against his own species. It was a betrayal of everything the Karathax represented, but it might also be the only hope for preventing future genocides. The question that haunted her was whether Vextar would be strong enough to act on what he was learning, or if the weight of emotional understanding would destroy him before he could make a difference. Elena woke to the sound of alarms echoing through the estate. Emergency lights bathed her quarters in an eerie red glow, and she could hear the distinctive hum of Karathax military transports approaching the floating platform. Something was very wrong. The door to her quarters opened abruptly and Vextar entered with his usual guards. But Elena immediately noticed changes in his posture and behavior. The calculated movements were gone, replaced by something that looked almost like urgency. "We need to leave," he said without preamble. "The High Command has discovered our neural interface experiments. They're coming to arrest me for corrupting Imperial doctrine." Elena's heart sank as she understood the implications. The Karathax Empire maintained its efficiency through absolute logical purity. Any commander who showed signs of emotional compromise would be considered a threat to Imperial stability. "Where can you go?" Elena asked, surprising herself with her concern for her captor's welfare. "Nowhere within the Empire. But there are independent worlds beyond our borders, places where a former Karathax commander might find sanctuary if he had something valuable to trade." Elena realized he was looking at her with an expression she was learning to recognize as hope mixed with desperation. "You want me to come with you?" "I want to offer you a choice," Vextar corrected. "You can remain here and be transferred to another commander, probably one less interested in intellectual discourse. Or you can come with me into exile, knowing that I can no longer protect you with Imperial authority." The irony wasn't lost on Elena. The alien who had purchased her as a trophy was now offering her freedom, while staying behind meant returning to true slavery. But she also understood that Vextar was asking for more than just her company in exile. He was asking her to help him navigate a universe where emotional connections mattered more than logical efficiency. "Why would you give up everything for this?" Elena asked. Vextar was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried emotions that would have been impossible for him weeks earlier. "Because the neural interface showed me what I have been destroying. Every world we conquered was filled with beings capable of love, hope, creativity, sacrifice. We didn't just eliminate enemy combatants, we erased entire tapestries of meaning and connection." Elena felt a chill as she realized what Vextar was really saying. The logical, efficient conqueror was experiencing guilt for the first time in his existence, and the weight of a dozen genocides was crushing down on his newly emotional consciousness. "The pain doesn't go away, does it?" Elena said gently. "Now that you can feel what those connections meant to the people you destroyed." "No," Vextar admitted. "And I cannot continue serving an empire that creates such pain without understanding its meaning." The sound of approaching transports grew louder, and Elena made her decision. "I'll come with you, but not as your trophy or your possession, as your partner in figuring out how to stop this." Vextar's multiple eyes focused on her with an intensity that no longer seemed threatening. Partner, you've learned to feel emotion, but you don't understand how to act on those feelings constructively. I can teach you that. In return, you can help me understand how to reach other Carthax who might be capable of similar transformation. They moved quickly through the estate's service corridors, avoiding the main routes where Imperial troops would be searching. Elena marveled at how Vextar had transformed from her captor into her protector, his knowledge of the building's layout now being used to keep them both safe, rather than to imprison her. As they reached Vextar's private hangar, Elena saw that he had been preparing for this possibility. A sleek ship waited with supplies and data cores containing his research on conquered civilizations. But she also noticed something else. Several other beings from his collection were already aboard the vessel. You're freeing your other trophies? Elena asked. They are not trophies anymore, Vextar replied. They are witnesses to what their civilizations achieved before we destroyed them. If we're going to oppose the Empire, we'll need their knowledge and perspectives. Elena recognized the other beings from her months in the estate. A crystalline entity from the Veltar system, an android from the fallen Republic of Titans, a plant-based intelligence from the Verdant cluster, all of them species that the Carthax had hunted to near extinction. As their ship lifted off from the hangar, Elena watched through the viewport as Carthax military vessels surrounded the estate. She realized that Vextar had just committed the ultimate betrayal of his own species, choosing emotional understanding over logical loyalty. Where are we going? Asked Zethus, the crystalline being, her translated voice chiming like musical notes. To the Free Worlds Confederation, Vextar replied. They've been gathering refugees from Carthax expansion for decades. If anyone can help us build resistance to the Empire, it would be them. Elena studied her former captor as he piloted their ship away from the only home he had ever known. The neural interface had given him access to human emotions, but he was still learning how to process them. She could see the strain in his posture as he struggled with guilt, fear, and determination all at once. Vextar, she said quietly, what you're feeling right now, the guilt and pain over what you've done, that's how we know you're truly changing. Humans call it a conscience. It is. He paused, searching for words. Overwhelmingly uncomfortable. Yes, but it's also what will drive you to make things right. Conscience isn't just about feeling bad for past actions. It's about being motivated to prevent future harm. As their ship entered hyperspace, fleeing toward the unknown territories beyond Carthax control, Elena realized that something unprecedented was happening. For the first time in the Empire's history, a high-ranking Carthax commander had chosen to defect not for personal gain, but because he had learned to value the lives and cultures his people destroyed. It was a small beginning, but Elena understood the potential implications. If one Carthax could learn empathy and choose compassion over conquest, perhaps others could as well. The neural interface technology that had changed Vextar could be the key to transforming the Empire from within. But first, they had to survive the journey to Free World's territory, and Elena knew that the Carthax would do everything in their power to stop a defector who possessed intimate knowledge of Imperial military, strategies, and weaknesses. The revolution against the galaxy's most efficient, conquering machine had begun with the most unlikely of alliances, a human xenobiologist, and her former Carthax captor, bound together by shared understanding and the desperate hope that empathy could triumph over logic. The Free Worlds Confederation's border station hung in the void like a massive metal flower, its rotating sections designed to accommodate dozens of different species and their environmental needs. As their refugee ship approached the docking bay, Elena felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. This would be their first real test of whether Vextar's transformation was genuine enough to convince others. The reception committee was as diverse as Elena had expected. Representatives from a dozen species stood waiting in the main hangar, their universal translators creating a soft buzz of multilingual conversation. But the tension was obvious. Nobody was quite sure what to make of a Carthax defector claiming to want to join the resistance. Admiral Kestra Thorne, the human representative and current Confederation military commander, stepped forward as they disembarked. Elena felt a surge of emotion seeing another human after so long, but Admiral Thorne's expression was coldly professional. Dr. Rodriguez, I presume, We've heard reports about your capture during the siege of Earth. I'm glad you survived. Thorn's gaze shifted to Vextar with undisguised hostility. As for your companion, we'll need extensive proof that this isn't some elaborate intelligence operation. Elena had anticipated this reaction, but she felt Vextar tense beside her. Through their shared experiences, she had learned to read his body language, and she could see him struggling with the emotional impact of being met with suspicion and hatred. Admiral, Elena said carefully, I understand your caution, but Vextar has risked everything to be here. He's brought intelligence about Carthag's military capabilities, strategic plans, and most importantly, proof that their species isn't inherently evil, just conditioned by a society that suppresses emotional development. Pretty words, growled Captain Morgak, the Valdorian representative whose homeworld had been conquered only months earlier. But how do we know this isn't just another Carthag's trick? They're masters of deception. Vextar stepped forward, and Elena could see him making a conscious effort to control his posture, to appear less threatening to the assembled delegates. You cannot know, he said simply. I offer only my actions and the knowledge I carry. Judge me by what I do, not what I am. Over the following days, Vextar underwent intensive debriefing sessions with Confederation intelligence officers. Elena watched him answer thousands of questions about Carthag's military structure, fleet deployments, and strategic doctrines. The information he provided was incredibly valuable, but Elena could see the emotional toll it took on him to systematically betray his former comrades. Meanwhile, Elena found herself working with Confederation scientists to document the neural interface technology that had changed Vextar. The implications were staggering. If they could replicate the process, they might be able to awaken empathy in other Carthags, potentially converting enemies into allies. The problem is finding subjects, explained Dr. Yilan Vasquez, the Confederation's chief xenopsychologist. Most captured Carthags choose suicide rather than surrender, and the few prisoners we have are too traumatized or hostile to attempt psychological intervention. Elena nodded, understanding the dilemma, but she had an idea that might solve both problems. What if we don't start with prisoners? What if we target Carthags, who are already questioning their role in the Empire? How would we identify such individuals? Elena glanced toward the intelligence briefing rooms where Vextar was still answering questions. Vextar knows the psychological profiles of other commanders. Some of them must be struggling with doubts, especially those who've been involved in the most brutal campaigns. The plan that emerged was audacious and dangerous. Using Vextar's knowledge of Carthag's communication protocols, they would attempt to make covert contact with potentially sympathetic commanders, offering them the same neural interface experience that had transformed Vextar. Admiral Thorn was skeptical. It's an enormous risk. If even one of these contacts reports back to High Command, they'll know we have a defector and intelligence operation. But if it works, Elena countered, we could start converting their commanders one by one. Imagine what would happen if even a few Carthag's fleet commanders suddenly developed consciences. The first contact attempt was made 3 weeks later. Commander Zekthar, who had served under Vextar during the conquest of the Android Republic, received an encrypted message through what appeared to be routine military communications. The message contained technical specifications for the neural interface and a simple question. Do you ever wonder what we have truly destroyed? The response came back within hours, and it changed everything. Zekthar hadn't just acknowledged the message. He had shared details about his own growing doubts about the Empire's methods. Other commanders, it seemed, were also struggling with questions they had been trained never to ask. Elena watched as Vextar read Zekthar's response, and she saw something she hadn't expected to see in a Carthax: tears. The biological response was different from humans, but the emotional meaning was identical. I have condemned him, Vextar said quietly. By awakening these questions in his mind, I have made it impossible for him to continue serving the Empire with logical efficiency. He will suffer as I suffer, but he'll also have the chance to choose differently, Elena replied, to become something better than what he was created to be. Over the following months, a secret network began to develop within the Carthax military. Commanders who had experienced the neural interface started identifying others who might be ready for transformation. The process was slow and dangerous. Several attempts resulted in capture and execution when commanders proved unreceptive to the message. But the network grew. And with each new convert, the Confederation gained not just intelligence but proof that the Carthax Empire's greatest strength might also be its greatest weakness. Their logical efficiency depended on emotional suppression, but once that suppression was broken, their capacity for empathy and moral reasoning was as strong as any species. Elena found herself in the strange position of being a teacher to former enemies, helping traumatized Carthax commanders learn to process emotions they had never been allowed to feel. It was exhausting work but also deeply meaningful. Each successful transformation represented not just a military victory, but the salvation of an individual consciousness from the prison of forced logic. The breakthrough came when Commander Velshan, one of the Empire's most decorated strategists, not only underwent the neural interface but actively began sabotaging Carthax military operations from within. Supply lines were disrupted, intelligence was leaked to targeted worlds, and entire fleets found themselves operating with mysteriously ineffective battle plans. The Empire began to notice that something was wrong, but their logical analysis couldn't account for the possibility that their own commanders were developing consciences. They assumed technical failures, communication breakdowns, or external sabotage, anything, except the truth that their most trusted officers were learning to feel empathy for their victims. Elena stood on the observation deck of the Confederation's new mobile command center, watching as reports came in from across the galaxy. Carthax advances were slowing, resistance was strengthening, and for the first time since the Empire's expansion had begun, their conquest machine was starting to break down. Beside her, Vextar monitored communications from their growing network of converted commanders. He had learned to smile in the months since their escape, though the expression still looked strange on his alien features. "Is this what hope feels like?" he asked, using a human emotional concept that would have been impossible for him to understand before their neural link. "Yes," Elena replied. "This is hope, and it's contagious." They called her his trophy, but Elena Rodriguez had become something far more dangerous to the Carthax Empire. She had become the teacher who showed their enemies how to feel, and in doing so, had planted the seeds of a revolution that would transform the galaxy.